Good morning. Good morning. It is such a blessing to get to be here learning with you today. And I'm really especially grateful um, because I'm feeling particularly challenged this week with the news that's coming out of Harvard, with the news that's happening in Newton. Last night was on a call with the FORJ, which is a parent organized justice organization in the Newton Public Schools, talking about the recent rise in swastikas being painted on school bathrooms. And all of this feels really challenging. It feels like, I don't know if you got to take a look ahead of time. We'll look a little bit into the letter, but the recent letter that was written by the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson um, is really quite disturbing. The way that BDS has become so mainstream, that delegitimizing Israel has become so mainstream, and there's a real question about what do we do about that? What do we do in the face of that? And coming here and speaking with all of you, I feel like you've lived in a different world than I've gotten to live in. I was writing about in the teaser a little bit about my own life experience, which is that by the time I came into the world, there was already much more, I think, criticism of Israel and much more intensity around Israel. And I shared in the teaser when I went to pick out my bat mitzvah talis, I distinctly remember the conversation in the store. And of course, it was in this little teeny, Judaica boutique in Colorado. And there were all these, the normal talitzot with the rainbows and the stripes and the black and the blue. And I fell in love with this beautiful blue silk talis with a painting of Jerusalem on the bottom. And I still remember to this day the question, are you sure you want to have Jerusalem on your talis? Isn't that just a little bit intense? And already that narrative was so different than the narrative of my grandparents and my great-grandparents, who I know spent all of their energy, and every Jew that they knew spent all of their energy and their love and their light and their resources to be able to support Israel. And that was uniformly accepted, and not just uniformly accepted, but everybody felt this deep passion and connection. And I want to just I don't know quite what happened to that, or where we, how we got to where we are now. But today I want to think about sort of where are these students coming from? What's driving the letter that they wrote and their mission? And what's our response? So I just want to pause here for any thoughts or reflections thus far before we dive into our source sheet. And you can go ahead, if you have something to share, you can go ahead and unmute. Oh, Joyce, are you trying to share? Here, let me see.
My generation still remembers World War II and the horror stories. And we really were inculcated with the feeling that Israel was the place that saved Jews, that was the backup, that Israel is more than just a country. Mm-hmm. It was the place where Jews could rely on as the place to save them. And those feelings are very deep. Now, as far as I'm very disturbed because we still have a youngster going into college. And I noticed my message to him is to go to a safe school. And I'd like him to go to, for example, Boston University, which has a good Hillel, and I feel the kids are protected there. But, we've let in immigrants from all over, and apparently a lot of quotes Palestinians, and their message seems to be to speak against Israel. And young people, we've raised idealistic young people to be for justice and truth and all of that, and these messages are now directed at Israel, that Israel is not doing that. Israel is a negative, whereas we've raised our kids to embrace all of these values, and they're being turned against Israel. It's very disheartening. I will say that. It's very disheartening.
Yeah, and Joyce, I just want to respond on a couple of points. One, I want to say, I think there probably was a time where there were safe schools and unsafe schools vis-a-vis Israel. And at this point, I think that it's pretty ubiquitous across college campuses, at least in the United States, that the prevailing voice is one of real questioning of Israel. And that's not just, you mentioned that there are lots of immigrants. I don't think that that's an immigrant story. One of the things that I cited in the letter that I sent out about this class was the letter that had been written by rabbinical students across the country a year ago. And that's Jewish students, that's Jewish rabbinical students. And so this is a movement that's not just from the outside in, it's also very much from the inside. And I think as we think about how we're going to respond, we really have to be thinking about how do we see these young people, where they're coming from. I think you're totally right that there is this idealism. And it was just so interesting for me as I was trying to get sources together. I was really thinking like, okay, if I can look in Jewish tradition and think about what's motivating, if I'm seeing these students in the best possible light, which I want to believe that our young adults who are doing this are really coming from a place of idealism or coming from a place of love of Israel. If I see that, how do I understand their behavior in Jewish tradition? And what became very interesting is that the same response that works for our young people about what they're thinking about feels like the response that we have to them. But before we get there, Susan, I saw your hand up. Were you wanting to speak? You're unmuted now.
No, I'm muted. Yes, good morning. I woke up early, particularly because I'm in Seattle, to listen to you, Aliza, because my synagogue here, which is pretty progressive, along with the kitchen in San Francisco, is having a trip to the West Bank this summer. That's their Israel trip.
Wow.
Most of the people who are going are the people who could more, are some of the older congregants, not just the young congregants. And they're very supportive. Now, they've also had a lot of, Palestinian Israeli workshops, similar to the discussion you had, peace parents of whatever the organization, Parents for Peace or something like that, which have been interesting, and I participated. But I still haven't figured out this trip to the West Bank, to the Palestinian that the rabbis arranged. And I really wanted to hear your perspective and be part of this, because it's not where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't understand. I really don't.
Yeah. No, and I think there's also, I'm seeing a lot of hands going up. There's, I think, a deep place for listening and getting to know. And it's a very interesting choice that you're sharing, that's the Israel trip. I see Judy, and then I see Susan Myron, and anyone else that wants to speak, and then, okay, perfect. So we'll do Judy and then Susan, and then we'll go to the sources. Judy. And I'll go ahead and unmute you. There you are, you're unmuted.
So I just got on and I'm responding to what this other woman just said, and I need to urge everybody, have they read Noah Tishbe's book on Israel, A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth? There is a superb chapter on BDS, and there's a superb chapter before that on the Palestinians. And the Palestinians are not one group. They're Israeli Arabs, there are Palestinians living in the West Bank, and there are Palestinians living in Gaza. And we and our kids need to understand who all these people are, but we really need to understand BDS, and her chapter on it lays it out. And I'm very concerned that most people, and certainly so many of our young people on the college campus, have no idea what she tells you and shows you the sources where she gets the information, and they would be shocked. And it's misinformation and so forth. And she shows you how they're suckered in, and you know, the BDS is it's very dangerous and it's very scary, but we need to read it, understand it, and disseminate it to our kids and to one another. Otherwise, it's a one-sided situation. And my God, I hope we're smart enough and we're proud enough to be Jews to question things and say, wait a minute, let's research this issue. All right.
Thank you, Judy. Susan.
I have my usual one sentence response. I said to my husband this morning, I wish I were 91 and a half, because I am really at this point this morning living in complete fear of what's ahead, and how lucky he was, you know, that he doesn't have to wait for the Supreme Court to outlaw abortion and the BDS movement to get bigger and bigger. I am so deeply scared and concerned, and I have no idea what to do. That's it. No idea.
I hear you. So the book that Judy was I'm looking at the chat. This is the book that Judy was recommending. It's Noah Tishby's book about Israel. I hear you, and I think so. What I would like to do now is to dive into the sources a little bit. And first, I want to look at this letter that was published in the Harvard Crimson. And again, I want to just be really careful to say that this letter could be a letter from any college campus. And in fact, we could be looking at the letter by rabbinical students. We could be looking at, you know, any number of pieces written by young people. And what I want to ask is that if we can just set aside for a moment our connection to Israel and our connection to history, and just look at this as if we are sort of aliens arriving on the planet, trying to discern where these students are coming from. What's their driving force? What is motivating them to write this letter? I think that's a really important response. Before we even get to like, how do we respond? We have to really deeply hear them. So I'm going to put up on my screen the letter. And I'm wondering, let's see, Judy Bornstein, would you be willing to read that first paragraph, when oppression strikes? No, you would not be willing to read.
Okay, I can't see.
So that would make it difficult to read.
Yes.
Susan, would you be willing to read? Susan Tregerman?
Oh, okay, you unmuted me.
Yes, please, I unmuted you.
When oppression strikes anywhere in the world, resistance movements reverberate globally. The desire for rightful justice spreads like wildfire, moving us to act, to speak, to write, and right our past wrongs.
Okay, we'll just pause there. What's the message? What is the message of this letter? Where are they coming from? What problem are they responding to? In their eyes. Susan Myron.
In one word, injustice.
Injustice.
That's it.
That's it. They see an injustice, and they're equating this with all global injustices.
Yep.
So this feels like a really important place to pause. One of the things that Danielle Hartman has really spoken about so beautifully is the need for us, as we're thinking about responding to young adults, that they are having a moral conversation, that they are taking issue with what is happening with Israel, and they see it as a stain, not just on them, their identity as Jews, not just on identity as global citizens, but that this is the primordial sin of the world, which is that those in power subjugate those who are without power. And what is challenging about this, as we know, as we're reading this, is that this perspective does not take into account a historical awareness or a sense of what has happened previously in Israel. This is very much just coming into the now and seeing what is happening now and moving really quickly to judgment and to response. So I want to take a look. This letter goes on and on and on. And they talk about, you know, the effective protests that have happened on campus in their eyes, and about how they're now fully endorsing BDS. In my read of this letter, their view of BDS is that this is one way to create justice for Palestinians. There's not a sense of reality for Jews. There's not a sense of the security reality. None of that is part of the conversation. This is all sort of a global response to perceived injustice. So I want to look at a couple of sources. And what was interesting to me as I was looking for, like, where are these students coming from? I pulled a beautiful text that I really love looking at, which is a midrash that comes from Vayikra Rabba. And I think this is very much where the students are coming from. I think it's also, in many ways, where we have to be coming from as we look at these issues, as we look at BDS sprouting up across campuses and anti-Semitism sprouting up in Newton public schools and our college campuses. This text speaks to the obligation that we all have to do our part to speak up. Jen, would you be willing to read this Vayikra Rabba?
Taught a parable. Men were on a ship. One of them took a drill and started drilling underneath him. The other said to him, "What are sitting and doing?" That doesn't make sense.
What are you sitting and doing? Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I should have gone over this.
He replied, "What do you care? Is this not underneath my area that I am drilling?" They said to him, "But the water will rise and flood all of us on the ship." Next page. Where am I?
Great. That's perfect. So I just love this parable. Here you have this guy on a ship, and he's just like minding his own business. He's just happened to be, got a little drill happy. He's going to drill a hole in the boat underneath him. And the other guys on the ship are like, "What are you doing? Don't you realize that your actions are going to flood this boat?" And he's like, "What's your problem? It's my area of the world. It's my area of the boat. I can do what I want to do." So any responses? Suzanne, I'm watching your face. You are responding a lot to this article. Do you want to share what comes up for you as you read this text?
Well, what one person does affects many. Obviously, it's an obvious consequence here that water does not stay contained, will not stay contained in his area. It will spread and affect everyone, just as hate does. The speech that we're hearing, a lot of people are vulnerable and don't understand the issues. Their historical reference to Israel is very limited. So they see just the here and now. They don't understand that whatever is happening now is the result of past behaviors. And, Israel is in a mode of survival. It will not commit suicide to please the progressives, but the progressives don't understand what really is the background to all of this. So it behooves Jewish leadership to spread information that's relevant. And maybe that book, I would have not read that book. I certainly will.
Thanks, Joyce. Suzanne, did you want to say something? Okay, no. Is there anyone else that would like to reflect on this? Debbie.
Yeah, I have
Debbie, are you there?
I asked my mother what happened to the Arabs in Israel before Israel was declared a country, a nation. She said they were offered money to go elsewhere. My Israeli, can you hear me still?
Yes, now we can, yes.
Okay. My Israeli uncle said they have a country, they had a country already, Jordan. So I was young when I heard these answers.
Debbie, I think we're having some audio challenges. I really want to hear what you have to say, but it's not coming
I'm
across.
sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's okay. Will you try putting it in the chat so that we can all read it? I think the audio is just not coming through, but what you're saying is really important and I would love to read it.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you. So I think one of the interesting things for me about this text is that I think this is the perspective of the college students, of the young people that I talk to about Israel. I think that this is very much the perspective that they have taken on, which is that injustice in Israel feels to them like it has the potential to drown the entire world. And they take it that seriously. And they feel like it is imperative upon them to speak up. Now, interestingly, when we see things about BDS, when we see antagonism towards Israel, for us, it feels clearly that this is equally true about BDS and about the kinds of activism that's happening on college campuses, that it has the potential to flood our boat, to endanger our livelihood, our well-being, our very ability to survive, since, as Joyce, you mentioned so rightfully, Israel really is that place that we count on to be our salvation, to be the place that we can go no matter when things go bad in the rest of the world. At least we've got Israel. So when we think about how to respond to these young adults, we have a challenge because we're all operating from this basic survival place that we feel like we are fighting for survival. Thank you so much, Debbie. Yeah. Dorothy, Dottie, I unmuted you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
We can.
Yeah. What bothers me more than anything else, I think children, and they are, in my mind, children. There was something on television or the radio or the other day that the mind does not mature. The brain is not fully mature till they're 21 to 25 years old. Children usually are a product of their environment. Now, I was thinking about this. I'm sure they still do it. Birthright, you know what that is. The kids in college automatically, I think the only money that comes out of their pocket is their spending money. They have to get to New York. I had two granddaughters who did it. One went back. They were so impressed. And many of their friends went back a second time because what they saw inspired them. I don't understand. Are they not doing this anymore? They're in their late 20s. So I'm talking probably 12, 14 years ago. I think they started at age 18.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
So they are still doing birthright. And I think, you know, what you're sharing, Dottie, is true. And also what Debbie is putting in the chat is also true, right? It is true that our children still have access to go to Israel and experience the blessings and the magic and the joy and the delicious food, all of that. And it is also true that they are very aware of what happened to Palestinians and Arabs in Israel. And we have to figure out a way that teaches our children to love Israel and enables them to grapple with a complex history. It's not all beautiful. And it's really challenging and problematic for the Palestinians that were there, who were exiled from their homes, whose land was stolen. Like, that's also true. And it is also true that there's been years and years and years and generations of violence and terrorism. And it's also true that there were opportunities and there were attempts. All of that is true. So we have to wrestle with a complex historical narrative, and we have to teach our children how to engage in a way that honors the moral compass that we so admire in them and is awake to the history and awake to the realities of history. So what I want to do, I want to keep moving to this next bit. I want to go, we're moving into the realm of tochacha. And tochacha is a particular category of rebuke when you see someone that is doing something that is harmful, that is doing something that is endangering the community, that is doing something that has the potential to have disastrous consequences, you have to speak up. Our tradition teaches us that you must speak up, you must speak your truth. And this is such a beautiful and interesting teaching that comes from Leviticus 19. V'lo tisna et achicha. You cannot hate someone in your heart. We'll come back to that, but no hating someone in your heart. Reprove your kin. Hochiach tochiach. You shall surely rebuke et amitecha, this person in your midst, and do not incur guilt on their account. What do we do with this? You cannot hate anybody in your heart. This feels like such an important moment. When we think about young adults, when we process this challenge about Israel, one of the things that we have to do before we even get to the conversation is we have to take out that judgment, that rancor, that anger, that how could you out of our hearts. When we're going to come to somebody and try to alter their behavior, we have to do it from a place of compassion, awareness, and understanding. That doesn't exempt us from speaking up. No, the opposite, right? This verse is very clear. You can't hate somebody in your heart, but you must speak up. And you cannot allow yourself to be dragged down by someone else's bad behavior. Ramban looks at this text and he says, you shall not bear sin because of him. What does that mean, he asks? That means if you do not rebuke someone who's doing something wrong, then it's on you. Then it's as if you have done that crime. You are responsible because you had an opportunity to intercede. You had an opportunity to stand up, and you did not. Our young people very much feel this. We very much feel this. So how do we move the needle? How do we build a world in which right now we just have these two different sides that are not listening to each other, that are each in their own little vortex of spinning ideology, and they're not able to hear from the other side? We haven't figured out that intergenerational conversation. Right now, it's just erupting on college campuses and erupting in letters to the editor and erupting all over our country. How do we build the kind of conversation that enables us to actually help each other not to incur guilt through this conversation? There's an interesting teaching in Mishle and Proverbs. I just love this. Do not rebuke a scoffer, for they will hate you. Reprove a wise person, they will love you. How do we do this? How do we build a world in which we are practicing the wisdom of being open to alternate perspectives, of being open to the possibility that we might be wrong? And I say this as a question, but I actually think in many ways that the younger generation, the millennials, Gen X, Gen Z that are coming up, have a harder time with this, are not as practiced with hearing other perspectives and listening to them because of the way that their world is curated and defined by social media and by echo chambers. It feels like a really important question. How do we build the capacity to listen across difference? So I just want to add one more piece to this puzzle, and then I want to open up to questions, and then I have another text afterwards that I want to share with everyone. I got a little text happy, but we've got plenty of time. Rabbi Yehuda Leib, he was known as the rebuker of Polonia. He was a Hasidic master. And he writes in his commentary on the verse we saw above from Leviticus that when we do this work of rebuke, when we see others that are doing something wrong, the first thing we have to do is check ourselves and make sure that there's not some sort of unspoken conflict. Make sure that there aren't unspoken feelings. And I think about this a lot when it comes to the dialogue about Israel, because one of the things I think is hard to communicate with young people, especially, is how their words and how their actions make us feel. And I think that often, and I'll speak just for myself, one of the things that comes up for me when I hear young people promoting BDS or speaking about a narrative of Israelis as oppressors, or, going with the Amnesty International report that the biggest sin in the world right now is Israel, is there's this anger that rises in my heart. And I just feel like, how could you? How can you not see the history? How can you not realize that the security that exists in Israel is a direct response to terrorism? How can you not see that Hamas has literally said they want to push Israel into the sea? They want to push Jews into the sea, that they want to kill us. How do you miss that? But reading Rabbi Yehuda Leib, I have to check that. And before I can have that conversation with them saying, like, what is this? I have to say, I'm realizing that when I hear you speak, one of the things that comes up for me is a real brokenheartedness. I'm realizing that I'm feeling really challenged because I'm actually afraid in these ways, and I experience the world in these ways as challenging, and I need to talk to you about how I'm feeling before we can even talk about this BDS thing. I just need to have a conversation with you about what comes up for me. And get rid of that. It's like releasing, if you're using a pressure cooker and you tip the scale so that the extra steam can get off before you can open the pot, right? Before we can have that BDS conversation, before we can have that conversation about what's actually happening now, we have to let the steam off. And that's often talking about our feelings. And it's true for us. It's also true for our children. We have to make a space for them to talk about where they're coming from, what they're feeling, what they've learned and what it's doing to them, and how they're processing all of that. That's the only space that we can really have a full conversation. So I want to pause here and ask for some reflections. And I'm going to continue scrolling through if you want to share any reflections. What's coming up for you as we're having this conversation? How does this strike you? What are you thinking?
Well, here I go again. I tend to talk too much, but there's a basic anger that comes up in me that this is a selectivity. What's behind this selectivity? Why Israel? There's so much injustice in the world. Primarily, look at our own land, what we took from the indigenous people in our own country. We don't seem to complain about that anymore, do we? There's plenty of injustice. And as you say, Israel is fighting for its policies are the result of survival. It needs to survive. And we're surrounded by bad neighbors. Israel is surrounded by bad neighbors, and it's had to be defensive. But we just have to look at America, how we took this land. We took this from indigenous peoples. That doesn't seem to bother these young people. They seem to target Israel as the worst country in the world, which is not the case at all.
Yeah. And I will say, I think that does bother young people. I think that there are, one of the other things that's happening right now is the demanding of organizations and institutions to reckon with their past of slavery and their past of pushing Native Americans out. It's across the board. Certainly a heightened attack towards Israel, but this is it's not unique to Israel. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that when we respond to our young people by saying, why aren't you looking at this injustice? Why aren't you looking at this injustice? That doesn't answer their challenge, which is a fair one. complex and challenging and painful as it is. Other reflections and thoughts? Susan Triggerman.
Hi, yeah, as I mentioned before, we're the focus of our congregation's trip here. Many of the congregants, many of the congregants, I have to say, are young families who grew up in Newton. Every time I go, they all went to Temple Emmanuel, and that's where they grew up, and that becomes my connection with this family. There are many, many families, and it's a very progressive synagogue. But my question is, in looking at this too, and talking to young people and thinking about our emotions, I also think about what didn't we educate them with? What was our responsibility 20 years ago or 10 years ago? And where did we maybe fail as parents or as community members that we didn't, that they feel this way and they feel such a, I want to express hatred towards Israel, because even those students who went on the birthright treaty and who went on strike or something a few years ago because they felt the trip was biased towards Israel, they were on a free trip to birthright and they're dictating what the curriculum should be. I just didn't get that. But anyway, I think of that sentence in terms of the conversation, and the compassion probably should have started when these people were young, not when they're 20.
Thank you, Susan.
And we failed.
John.
At the risk of being very unpopular, I think we did educate these young people to be interested in Jewish values, which are equality, which are care for your fellow person, which are against any mistreatment. And I think our problem, and their problem even more, is that a reflex response without saying, yes, there are bad things happening to Palestinians in the West Bank. The settlers can do what they want, and the Israeli soldiers look away. This is quite well documented. There are, according to today's time, 604 detained Palestinians without charge as of the beginning of May. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I am saying that's wrong. I am saying that if we don't acknowledge the complexity and also talk about security and so forth, if we don't do something to try and decrease the tension, as blocking his name, come to our shul, what? No,
Micha Goodman.
Micha Goodman has written very articulately, then we are complicit, and we do have part of that guilt. They will, if we blanket say, nothing's wrong, pro-Israel, and they do everything right, then I think the young are going to say, you taught me just the opposite. Why do you want me to go along with that? If we say there are problems, there have to be working towards solutions, but also don't give up on Israel, then I think we have a chance.
Mm-hmm. And I think, John, what you're saying feels so important, that one of the things that's happening on both sides right now is both sides are saying, no, you're wrong. I don't hear you. No, you're wrong. I don't hear you. And one of the things you're saying is actually we have to listen deeply. We have to hear where the young people are coming from. We have to acknowledge the complexity, the challenge, the reality that in pursuit of security, there are some human rights violations in the same way that there are human rights violations in our own country. And how do we address that and maintain security for Israel and hold on to the dream that we should get to have a homeland? We should get to continue to invest in that dream in a way that supports our people and supports the other people that are in that land.
I would like to recommend, paired with Noah Tishby's book, Dana Sokach's book called a Guide to Israel. I wrote it in the chat. They debated or talked together on a Hillel broadcast, which is very interesting. They both have important views, but it's certainly not one-sided. And if we react as though it's one-sided, we will lose the young people.
Thank you. Judy. Oh, hold on just a second.
I guess I'm appalled, or I don't know what the right word is. The lack of understanding how nuanced Israel is and how our young kids show, at least I think, they don't know, first of all, our history. And first we have to know our history, and we have to know, they have to have read Danny Gordis's book, A Concise History of Israel. They don't know anything about all these Jews that were forced out of Arab lands and left with nothing, but Israel took them in. This isn't a black and white situation that Israel's always right and the Palestinians are always wrong. Of course not. And a birthright trip is seeing something, but you need history. You need facts and knowledge, and you need things to question. And if we ask them what was BDS, I think we would be shocked, because it is not. It is not. And if we asked adults what it was, I think we'd be shocked for the lack of knowing what's in the charter, who's behind it, who's funding BDS. That's scary as can be. And I don't think there's even any questions about what is this, all right? And this, it's appalling to me, the lack of knowledge. It's scary. And for that, we all have to take responsibility. And so do the kids. They're being suckered in and they don't even know it. That's scary as can be. You have to question, what are you talking about, all right? And not from one source, but from many sources. And then you find the truth.
So Judy, I really appreciate that. And I think one of the pieces of work that we have to do, and this is something I learned from a CPE supervisor when I was at Mass General, is that anger often is a disguise for deep pain. And what I hear when you talk about you're feeling appalled and you're feeling angry, how can these young people not understand our history? There's also a brokenheartedness there. There's also a deep pain there, which is our people have suffered. We have generations and generations and generations of trauma. And it's one thing for the other people in the world to not get that trauma. It's one thing for other people in the world to not see our plight. But it feels like a deep hurt when our own children don't see and don't hear that. And that makes me feel, it makes us feel not just deeply unseen, but like hopeless and full of despair and what will be. And that generates the anger. And if we can get underneath that anger to that deep pain, that's a space that we can have a conversation. But what's happening is we're all ramping up and getting at these places of anger. And anger speaking to anger just doesn't allow for any real hearing. Esther, I see your hand up. I want to come to you.
Okay, I really appreciate that. To be honest with you, I'm Israeli. I lived in Israel for a long time. And I come from a position like, do not judge your friend till you stand in his shoes. All the rhetoric that I hear, it makes me angry, because what we are doing, we are repeating history. I heard Sergei Lavrov, the Russian guy, actually putting us as people who murdered Jews. That pissed me off. I want all the children to learn, to go to Israel, at least for half a year, and learn what's going on in order for them to stand and judge Israel. That really aggravates the heck out of me. And also the elder generation to go and live there and try to understand where we are coming from. I'm sorry, it really appalls me. There is so much anti-Semitism in this universe. And now we have the Israelis, or I'm sorry, the Jews hating Jews. Sorry, that appalls me. That really appalls me.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. It makes total sense to me. And I think we all have that work. Like, the work that we have to do is coming back to this, right? Coming back to that main principle of Leviticus, which is do not hate your kinsperson. Do not hate these young people in your heart. We have to get back to a place where we can see them and see their good hearts and the way that they are operating in the world and the way that they are trying that in this they are trying to love Israel. And I want to just be clear, I don't agree, but I do think that we have some work to do listening and some work to do to take off the pressure of our own anger and our own feelings of betrayal in order to be able to have these conversations. Karen, you're unmuted.
Yes, okay. This is great. I think this is terrific. And I know that I'm a passionate Zionist and I don't like to hear criticism of Israel, but I know that there's a lot that I don't want to look at and read. I don't want to. It's just very painful for me. And this is painful. And I think it's asking us all to grow a lot, to stretch ourselves a lot. And the other thing I want to say is that my cousin's grandchild went to college from Jewish day school and started advocating for Israel. And she was actually really shunned by the other kids. And she had a very, very difficult time. And somehow, I don't even know who funded this, and it's kind of concerning to me, but a Palestinian, a teacher who was Palestinian took a group of them, including her, to the territories. And when she came back, she wrote a letter to the newspaper saying she had it all wrong about Israel, and she realizes that Israel did oppress people, and she felt like that we needed to make reparations. And she told her family that I don't really feel like this, but I really feel like people are now talking to me on campus and they weren't before. So I don't know what she really feels, but it was very, very traumatic for her. And I feel really bad for our kids. Like they're in a real bind. And it's easier to just go along with the crowd. I mean, to be shunned when you're in college, that's a very difficult age to be shunned. And she's still struggling with it. She's out of college now, and she was traumatized by it.
Oh, thank you, Karen. I see Bruce, and then we'll go to Robin. Bruce, you're unmuted.
Thank you. I've just been listening, and I've dealt with this over many, many years. And I think someone made the point before. We need to know the history. Young people and anyone doesn't know the history of our country, certainly doesn't know the history of Israel. And, we forget Israel gave Gaza to the Palestinians with a $6 billion business that was thoroughly destroyed. My suggestion is that leadership is important, and that leadership had a strategy to keep the status quo like this. And I don't know how to deal with it. I've dealt with many opportunities to speak and meet with Palestinians. I've been to the West Bank several times, and it's just difficult to change people's opinions, especially when they don't know the history. And that's the job of leadership.
Thank you, Bruce. Robin.
I was just wondering what college campus Karen's grandchild was at.
It was Swarthmore.
Okay, thank you. Just wondering, because my son went to Tufts, and he was surprised too about the climate on the campus, and it really, some of the votes that they were doing were like the Passover, when a lot of Jews weren't on campus, and but he really just, I think, stayed away from all of the contention surrounding it, because it was so disturbing for him there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanna share sort of two models um, that I think are really helpful models. Um, the first is a model that I lived and experienced. I went after college. I moved to Israel, and um, by the time I moved to Israel, I had been very steeped in um, left-leaning, very progressive, what some in our community might call anti-Israel. Not so much that Israel doesn't deserve to exist, but very hyper aware of the civil rights violations that were happening in Israel. And I really wanted to get involved and to be a part of action in Israel. And I saw myself going there to be a force for good. And one of the interesting things that happened for me is that when I got to Israel and started being involved in going to protest and I did some of the tours that are you can do as an American that you can't do as an Israeli, going into the West Bank and speaking to Palestinians. And while I learned some things that sort of confirmed the bias that I came in with, I also discovered some things that really challenged me. And I remember these moments. I remember one moment I was in the West Bank at a protest, and someone came up to me and they told me that Israelis were spewing sewage on Palestinian villages, and I was like, I'm ready to act. What are they doing? Show me the pictures. What is this? And they sent me these photos, and I was looking at these photos, and even me, just recently graduated from college student, could tell that that wasn't a photo that had been taken in Israel, and that those weren't Israelis. And I kept asking for more information, and the story started to unwind. And I remember just the reality starting to set in as I was at these protests, which was that there was truth to every side. And the more that I learned and the more that I saw, I began to realize that the people that were on the right were totally right, that there were necessary actions that we needed to take in order to preserve our security, that these were thoughtful responses to serious threats to the Jewish people. And I learned that the people on the left were right, and that there were serious human rights violations, and that the more that I learned and the more that I grew, the more complex the situation became. And I began to see that there wasn't a single answer, and that an American young woman, as well-meaning as I was, I could never fully understand the conflict. The best that I could do was understand that it was beyond me and try to hold to a love of Israel and a love of justice, and create a place where I could support a relationship with Israel in a real sense. And that was a really important journey for me. So I think that it's really important, as we're thinking about our children, to expose them to that complexity. But then there's also another piece, which is something I saw work very effectively at Vanderbilt. They too had a situation. Vanderbilt is my alma mater, and they had a situation where the student newspaper also endorsed BDS. And one of the things that happened in that community is that the elders in the Jewish community reached out to the students and started having monthly meetings where they sat the students down and they just talked about sharing history and sharing knowledge about Israel and building those conversations. Oh, thank you for telling me that. I can't see everybody on the same screen. Connie, I'll come to you in just a second. And so building that conversation in that community. And I wonder what are the ways that we can facilitate the kind of dialogue that will enable us to move the needle, because I think what's happening now is we haven't figured out a way to talk to each other. We desperately do. We desperately need for our children to understand that this is much more complex than they're seeing on social media, and that when they understand the complexity, that may shift their understanding. Connie, I want to come to you. I'm sorry, I did not see you. I've been trying to scroll back and forth, but go ahead. You're unmuted. We can hear you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. My question is, are there any conversations like this that are taking place in the Jewish day schools and in the Sunday schools at Temple? Because it feels parallel to me, the teaching of critical race theory and how there's an attempt to understand the complexity of the history of our country. And there should be the same attempt teaching that in Jewish educational venues. So where is that? Does it exist?
Yeah, so I don't know. I can't speak to what is happening in day schools specifically. I don't know those curriculums as well. I know that in our own religious school, one of the things that we try to do, and certainly when I teach children, I try to give them a sense of the complexity. And we actually had a very interesting moment of this, not intentionally at all. But I don't know if you saw Karen Taub's exhibit that was here last weekend. With all the art that was in the Sidman Leventhal Community Court. She had one piece that Wes talked about in the Talmud class. If you want to go back, if you haven't watched it already, Wes talked to her about it. She put it right underneath Adelson Hall. And it was a whole list that was titled My Truth, The Truth. It was a whole list of truths. And one of the items on that piece was that Palestinians, I think it was Palestinians must have their own sovereign state, was written. And on Thursday of last week, my 5th graders came in and I was like, this is amazing. When do you get to meet an artist and look at her exhibit? So I told that, the kids met with Karen and they walked around her exhibit. And then, I told them their job was to come up with questions. And pretty soon after that, a group of about 5 kids came up to me and said, we have a question for you. What does it mean that Palestinians must have their own sovereign state? And so we got into a thoughtful conversation about sort of understanding for them some of the complexities, what that statement was meaning, what it was coming up against, and starting that conversation. And that's something that comes up somewhat organically in the classroom. Whenever, when we look at maps, when we talk about Israel, I try to always share with them the diversity of perspective that enables them to hold the possibility that there are other truths, while also wanting to give them a deep love of Israel and wanting to give them a connection to our Holy Land and a connection to the place that is central for all of us. For me, it's very important. I want all of our kids, I would love it if all of our kids, when they go to pick out their talitot for their b'nai mitzvah, when they go to think about their lives, that Israel is central, that they are holding that Holy Land deep in their hearts and they love it. And that they have the kind of critical thinking skills and the awareness that they can recognize it's complex. The reality on the ground, both there and here, it's complex. And I want them to know that they can both love Israel and have concerns about the world and work towards that. That's an okay perspective. So I recognize that we are out of time for today. And I just want to say to you all, thank you, deeply thank you for engaging in this topic. It's not an easy topic. I know that for many of us, it brings up a lot of emotion, a lot of intensity. And my prayer is that we can build the capacity to have these conversations so that when these letters get published and when these actions are happening, we can respond with love. We can take out that charge and have the kind of thoughtful conversations that will enable us to move forward towards a brighter future for Israel, for the Jewish people, and for the world. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a blessed day.